Live from Geneva, Switzerland, this is Open Work, a look inside the watch industry, a podcast from Collective Horology. I'm Gabe Riley, co-founder of Collective.
And I'm Asher Atkin, co-founder of Collective. Collective Horology is an independent watch retailer based in Southern California. We carry a wide range of independent brands, including Chapek, Speak Marine, Singer Reimagined, J.N. Shapiro, and more. To learn more about us and check out our available inventory, visit collectivehorology.com.
Asher, we were kicked out of the Beau Rivage hotel, weren't we?
We were unceremoniously told to leave.
Unceremoniously booted. You know, today I think we're going to talk a little bit about the drama of Geneva Watch Days, which I don't think is a bad thing. We'll probably come back to that at the end. But kind of one of the first dramatic things that happened is, and to set some context here, you know, Geneva Watch Days started really as a collector-driven event back in 2020. It was sort of a grassroots industry event that was put on. It was spearheaded, I think, by Breitling and a number of other brands, mostly independent brands, as a way to welcome collectors back to Switzerland, back to Geneva, in the summer of 2020, and give them an opportunity.
It was 2021.
No, it was 2020.
Was it really?
Yeah. I checked. As a way of kind of reopening and giving people a way to, you know, have some time together and go hands-on with watches, because we all know what was happening there. And I think really for the first few years, Geneva Watch Days was interesting in that as a kind of a counter to Watches and Wonders and other, you know, watch events. It was really enthusiast driven. And so what happens generally in the last few years is the watch industry sort of opens its doors in Geneva to collectors. And that means, you know, workshops are opened, brand boutiques are opened, but most brands obviously are coming from outside Geneva, whether that's within Switzerland, you know, if they're coming from the Jura or other watchmaking parts of Switzerland, or around the world, and they're renting hotel suites, generally by the waterfront. The Beau Rivage is kind of the center and the hub of operations. So the Beau Rivage is a very fancy hotel right on Lake Geneva in downtown Geneva. It's, I think, probably like an all-suite hotel because it's, you know, such a fancy and storied place. What ends up happening is those hotel suites get turned into these sort of temporary brand spaces. So the brands will rent suites in the hotel and sort of open them up. And unlike Watches and Wonders, where really, you know, you have to have an appointment, you have to be within the industry, the doors are sort of flung open. Collectors, people from the industry obviously do show up. We're here. And the doors are opened. And as a result, we were meeting with some friends, in fact, another brand in the lobby of the Beau Rivage. So like all hotels, the Beau Rivage has a lobby. They have a lobby bar that's open to the public. And it ends up being a convenient place to meet, although a very expensive place to meet. We've learned just how expensive that lobby bar can be firsthand, but ends up being a convenient place to meet, because it is sort of the unofficial center of Geneva Watch Days. Right across the street is the official tent and pavilion for the event. So a lot of people who are attending the event are in the area of the Beau Rivage. We met a brand there, and one of the first things that happened, of course, when you meet with anyone who's in the watch industry or just a fan of watches, is watches inevitably get passed around. So we were looking at some watches, and a hotel employee came out, and fortunately my French was good enough to understand. He told us, "You can't have watches out in this room, so please put them away." And I didn't really understand the context or why, but we sort of said, "Oh, I figured it was actually a security reason, like maybe there had been a robbery or something like that, and they didn't want watches being passed around."
Makes sense.
So I was like, "Oh, okay, fine." We put the watches away, and then often as happens at, you know, when you're doing business, some paperwork was taken out. So we were being shown basically a presentation, and some papers were being passed around.
Papers with photos of watches.
With renders of watches. Yeah, so sure. Papers with renders of watches were being passed around so we could look at and discuss a couple things. And another hotel employee came up to us and said, "I'm sorry, but if you're going to do that, you need to leave. You cannot be doing business here." And what she explained was, because there are other brands who are paying money to exhibit at the hotel, and I have to imagine it's quite expensive given just how nice the hotel is and the location and the circumstances, they didn't want people essentially or not quote, but they didn't want people crashing the Beau Rivage and using the public spaces to meet and conduct business. Now, I'm of two minds about this. On the one hand, I do understand the perspective that there are people exhibiting brands who we work with and had meetings with, which is why we were there, exhibiting and paying good money to be there. And out of respect to them, they don't want, scrappy upstarts showing up and doing business. Fair enough. On the other hand, we're paying customers of a public, in this case, a public bar, restaurant, or whatever. And nothing was disclosed to us before we sat down and paid a lot of money for some coffees, water, and a hot chocolate on a 90-degree day in Geneva.
You know who you are.
You know who you are. And so that's where I kind of fall on it, is like, if you're going to have that policy, at least disclose it. I didn't feel great about it. And by the way, if Geneva, and this is sort of my point, if Geneva Watch Days is really supposed to be an enthusiast catered event, or an event that caters to enthusiasts, when enthusiasts get together, watches are inevitably passed around. That's sort of like the common denominator of any watch enthusiast meetup. And, obviously we were in a business context, but most people there are not. And there was a post with a lot of comments on it, I think it was from Deluxe, about the same thing, being kicked out of the Beau Rivage for passing around watches. And there were a number of people, including people who are outside the industry and who are just enthusiasts, who commented that the same thing had happened to them. So what this tells me, long way of saying, what this tells me is Geneva Watch Days is changing. It's moving from an event that was really focused on the collector and the enthusiast to being more of an industry event. And this represents to me a professionalization, right or wrong, a professionalization of Geneva Watch Days, which I think is really interesting.
So I'll admit that I think this is something that annoyed you a bit more than it annoyed me. I thought it was just kind of ridiculous and silly, but whatever. But if we zoom out and we look, to your point, at the broader image, when we went live from Watches and Wonders, Gabe talked about the invasion of the suits. We are relatively informal people in the way that we dress. We're from California. It's, I'm walking around here in Geneva, which is incredibly hot, by the way, in, a button-down linen shirt and shorts, So I probably look pretty casual relative to the formality generally of the watch industry. But when we walked into the Beau Rivage, there were lots of people wearing suits, which, by the way, like, on the one hand, I tip my hat to you folks, because how you walk around in 90 degrees in a suit, that woof. But that's another issue. But when we look at this on the broader standpoint, like, I don't want to complain about, like, spilt milk, so to speak, here. Watch events evolve, and I think to a certain degree this is a demonstration of the profundity of this event. Like, we can quibble around the edges regarding the silliness of the Beau Rivage's policies, but what the broader picture here is that there's so many people here now to do business, that business is happening the way business happens at conferences, which is wherever you meet the people that you want to work with. Serendipitous encounters are really the primary reason to come to conferences and to events like this when you think about it, because who you bump into.
Absolutely. And
right.
we weren't crashing the Beau Rivage bar for the purposes of the meeting. We bumped into the people we were sitting down with at the Beau Rivage because everyone's there doing business.
Yeah. And it's
exactly.
And there is a presumption, to your point, to give you a little credence for your grumpiness, that if you go into a restaurant and you sit at a table and you buy something, that you can have a conversation and the restaurant can't tell you what the parameters of the conversation are. But at a more broad level, it does show like there are enough people here that I'm getting pulled in one direction, Gabe in another, to sit down and meet with people, which is the whole reason that we flew the thousands of miles to Geneva. So, while this is a sort of an irritation relative to it, it does paint a broader picture of the event itself. And while that was sort of a silly thing that happened, it actually wasn't, in my mind, indicative of our first day yesterday. Our first day was, frankly, I think, incredibly positive. And One of the things that really struck me as we ran into friends or had our meetings that were sanctioned in rooms at the Beau Rivage. I'll move off it now.
I want to be clear. I'm not that grumpy about the whole thing. To me, it's just it signaled a shift in the tone and tenor of the event. The stakes are now higher at Geneva Watch Days than they once were, which is
okay. Good point.
Which is okay.
Absolutely. And I think when we apply that to the broader picture, what we saw were some really interesting things. We saw a number of really important announcements and releases, which we're going to talk about today. One release in particular, one announcement in particular. But also the fact that people and brands now are looking at Geneva Watch Days as a real platform, not just to interact with collectors and clients, but also to announce product. So in a sense, it's become the second tentpole of the year, with Watches and Wonders being the first in April, and now this being the second at the end of the year. And frankly, I think that's really cool, because the other thing is people used to, kind of complain that there really was only SIHH and Baselworld, which used to be only about, 8 weeks apart, 9 weeks apart, give or take. And then for the rest of the year, it was kind of a desert of releases. And now, as that's become decentralized post-COVID, we're not only seeing a regular cadence of releases freed from shows like what the Swatch Group is doing, we're starting to see independents have essentially their own tentpole for announcing new watches and new ideas, which really is Geneva Watch Days. Not a lot of major market brand or mass market brands releasing stuff here. All the news is really independent focused, making Watches and Wonders the tentpole fundamentally for the major market.
Well, sort of. One thing I thought was really interesting is that Tudor announced a novelty at the beginning of this week, and this is not a brand that is participating in exhibiting at Geneva Watch Days. Mm-hmm. So even they are sort of co-opting the moment and crashing the party. Yeah, that's how far Geneva Watch Days has come. Forget the event, it's now a week for watch news.
Yeah, but if you look at that, I was thinking about that earlier today. And when you look at the way that independents treat Watches and Wonders, it's kind of the same way that some mass market in this instance, Tudor is treating Geneva Watch Days, right? Most independent releases get announced the week before Watches and Wonders so that they don't get lost in the mix of all the announcements coming from Rolex and Tudor and Patek, et cetera, et cetera. And here we had a mass market brand, Tudor, making an announcement about a product launch immediately before Geneva Watch Days so that they didn't get missed or get lost in the mix of the independent releases. So honestly, I thought that was kind of cool. You could look at it and be like, oh, well, Tudor swooped in and made a big announcement. Or you could just say, well, Tudor has enough respect for Geneva Watch Days to realize it's a news-making moment.
Oh, it's the second biggest week in watches.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think it's really cool to see a major market brand kind of riding on the coattails, so to speak, of the news and information being released by independents. So that's pretty neat. And then there's just the general vibe. This was the thing that we wanted to, stick our finger up in the air and see what it felt like in Watches and Wonders. And it was definitely a little bit more tenuous there. I think people are kind of looking around being like, is everything okay? Are we going to be okay? Yeah, we're going to be okay. And now, here, there was definitely a sense of like, okay, yeah, all right, this feels good. And, we'd go in and meet with folks. And one meeting we even went to, I was just talking to Gabe about this before we started recording, had almost a sense of just like unbridled joy. Like we went into this, it was a brand suite brand that we work with.
We can say who it was. It was the Chapek meeting.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah. Okay. So it was with Chapek and we walked in and the suite was filled with a mixture of retailers and enthusiasts. There were watches everywhere. People were walking around. People were laughing. It felt great. And by the way, I want to just demonstrate like that is so different than when you meet with someone at Watches and Wonders. When you meet with someone at Watches and Wonders, you have a 30-minute slot in a booth at a gigantic hall, and you do your business, and you shake hands, and you're out. I think we probably could have hung out at the Chapek suite for as long as we wanted if we didn't have other business to do.
Oh, sure. And people were coming in unannounced, wanting to check things out. Yeah. Watches were flying around left, right, and center. But I think what you put your finger on is really important, which is we've talked on our Watches and Wonders pod and others about like the tone and tenor of these events. And I think for the last few years, we've sort of seen the industry and the tone being one of a little bit of uncertainty, everyone trying to feel out the climate of the industry. and in some cases pretending that nothing is happening. That's a sort of a hallmark of the Swiss watch industry, is a little bit of gaslighting, which is everyone else's brand is doing terribly, but mine is fine. And I think what's interesting is what I'm seeing now and what I'm feeling now in the meetings we have is everyone has accepted the current reality, which is that the watch industry is not in the place it was a couple of years ago, where watches were just sort of flying out the door and everything sold. And people have accepted we're in a new paradigm where collectors are much more thoughtful, and what's required to win business, to inspire collectors, to get other partners excited is a little bit more, well, we can talk about this more specifically, but more creativity, doing things that are more interesting. So to me, there's a feeling that like we're all on the same page about the reality of the industry, which I don't think was quite the feeling in the last few Watches and Wonders. I think the industry was slowly coming to terms. Some brands more than others, some people more than others. But what I'm feeling and what I'm hearing here is everyone is on the same page about the broader climate, which is good, because that's constructive. If we can agree on what reality is, we can navigate it.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it, and probably a good way to segue into, I think, one of the big stories coming out of the show from a business standpoint that we want to talk about, which was a collaboration between two brands that we personally know and we personally love, which was Studio Underdog and H. Moser. So in brief, if you haven't seen this, you can, I'm sure, head to Instagram and get a really quick overview of it. But essentially, Studio Underdog, founded 2021 by Richard Bank out of the UK, much loved, much lauded upstart brand that really, I think, launched itself out the door by creating unexpected watches that were both incredibly well designed and thoughtful and irreverent in their own way. You know, if you're unfamiliar, although I suspect a lot of you guys are familiar, you know, they're the watermelon watch, the cookies and cream watch, the pizza watch. You know, they are defined by really turning the design of the watch industry on its head and showing that like something can be joyful or silly or tongue in cheek and still be a serious bit of design, which in many ways is a parallel path of H. Moser, another brand which has demonstrated that serious watchmaking can also have a sense of humor and make fun of itself. You know, all of the advertising that Edouard Mélin, the CEO, has participated in, you know, is extraordinarily irreverent, in many cases self-deprecating.
So are the watches themselves.
Yeah, exactly. You know, long live the cheese watch. And Moser has had a long tradition taking risks on, you know, partnership with new brands. I mean, they took a risk on us. We partnered with them for our second collaboration in the C series almost 4 years ago. So it really made sense that Edouard would see opportunity in working with Richard and vice versa. And what I also think is particularly remarkable about it, and this is really, I think, something that Edouard and the team at Moser deserve a lot of credit for, you don't tend to see haute horology brands looking to and rising and helping to rise up micro brands. And he did it, I suspect, because he had massive respect for the creativity and innovation coming out of Studio Underdog.
And a philosophical alignment.
Well, it's not just philosophical. Another thing anecdotally that I've seen, I have no quantitative evidence to prove this, but I've certainly seen it, is that many serious high-end collectors have a Studio Underdog in their collection. So from a purely business standpoint, it made a lot of sense. There's crossover between those communities. And it really, I think, demonstrates that good design, or I think as Edouard, I'm paraphrasing here, but said in his Instagram Live when they launched it, that passion can exist at every price point, and that passion can be can be something that doesn't have to be anchored to or purely owned by, you know, a community of micro brands or high-end haute horology brands. So to that end, when I started to see the teasers a couple of days ago, I got really excited because I thought, you know, first of all, hat tip to Moser, hat tip to Studio Underdog. This is the collaboration nobody saw coming. You know, like, this is awesome. What is fascinating, and by the way, I'm going to preface by saying we saw the watches in person yesterday. They're gorgeous. They're really gorgeous, and they're thoughtful, and they're creative. And perhaps most impressive, you have one cohesive idea executed at 2 different price points and in the voice and methodology of each brand. So, for example, the dial of the Studio Underdog component, it's a two-piece collaboration. The Studio Underdog piece is finished and appears like it could have been a standalone Studio Underdog watch. And when you look at the Moser perpetual calendar, that's part of the collaboration. The Studio Underdog is a chronograph. When you look at the QP, it uses the same color scheme, the same creative idea, but it's brought to life using the Métier d'Art of Moser. And it really feels like it could have been a Moser watch unto itself as well.
I think
color scheme notwithstanding.
If they had done that watch, people would have said, "Oh, that looks like a Studio Underdog design or colorway."
Yeah, but that's not what I'm getting at. What I'm getting at is that it feels like a Moser.
Yeah.
It's clearly a collaborative watch.
Yes, but it's a Moser. It's a Moser through and through.
Completely.
For sure. And by the way, our first meeting of Geneva Watch Days was with Moser, which is where we got to see the watch. And I do think it's important in terms of the way they presented the project to us, which is they were just as excited to show us the Studio Underdog as they were the Moser. We met with Bertrand Meilland, and he showed us the collection. And they were just as excited to show us both watches. And they said, look, this project is about our shared passion for creativity and for design and for irreverence. And I really can say, look, we've taken a lot of meetings with a lot of brands. It came from a place of genuine sincerity, which I thought was, it was wonderful. It was wonderful to see.
So here's sort of the crux of this. On the one hand, there's that part of this, which is fascinating, right? I mean, that's a serious evolution in the way that brands can work together. And again, out of respect to Moser, this certainly isn't the first time they've done that. They did that with MB&F in the past couple of times, and it's been wildly successful. But what I find fascinating here, and in our next episode, we're gonna do a full readout on the survey and all the perspectives that were shared with us in that. But I'll give you guys one first little glimpse at it. One overarching theme that we saw was a consistent desire at every collector price point. So collectors of sub $1,000 watches all the way up to $25,000 plus watches, all said that what they are seeking most is creativity, risk-taking, and innovation. And yet, a lot of the feedback in the public spaces like Instagram, where folks have been discussing this, hasn't been super positive. And it's an interesting thing that we're really turning over in our head. Because on the one hand, it's easy to dismiss people who, fire off something grumpy on Instagram as, a troll or a jerk or whatever. But I don't think that that's a way that we can effectively learn from,
how would you summarize the feedback that people are giving? Because I think it's important to share what the common objections are.
And I'm going to come back to the risk-taking point in a minute, because I think that's how we tie this together. But the general feedback is, and I'm going to characterize some of the more negative feedback. I was a huge fan of Studio Underdog because I thought that they, from the brand name on, represent, an upstart, quite literal underdog in the industry. And that's represented not just by irreverent design, but by incredibly accessible price points. I thought I was going to get something, as Gabe put it, kind of like a moon swatch, where I was going to get access to some element of Moser as liberated, if you will, by Studio Underdog, which, by the way, is a whole other idea than what came out here. Maybe it's a cool idea. I don't know, but it's a separate thing.
And to be clear, that's not necessarily possible, because these watches, as they were presented, have to be purchased as a kit together.
Yes. And I think that led to the second bit of feedback that the audience was providing, which is, man, I don't have $59,000 to buy the QP. I just wanted the $1,000 Studio Underdog, which is understandable in the sense that if I was a Moser collector, the difference of $1,000 between 59 grand and 60 grand to get both watches is, relatively speaking, a small leap. But if I'm a Studio Underdog collector, a $1,000 watch having a $59,000 additional one coming with it makes it probably quite inaccessible. So that was the feedback. But the thing that I found remarkable is that that sort of feedback is kind of in direct opposition with what we're hearing from the community about what they want. And I want to be clear here too. Like we have collectors are not a monoblock group. and no one survey can be representative of an incredibly diverse collector community globally. So, I am sort of tying two things together, but it is a theme that we're seeing and we're hearing affirmed by brands that we talk to, this idea that creativity and innovation is something that they really want to dig into, over the next few years. And here was something that exemplified that perfectly, but was met not, with universal frustration, because there's a lot of people out there who think it's awesome, but with like notable frustration. And it's an interesting.
I don't see it entirely that way.
Okay.
That is something we heard loud and clear in the feedback, but I would add two caveats. Caveat one would be, I want innovation and creativity and novelty in the lane in which I collect, the price point in which I collect, the segment of brands or the industry in which I collect, whether that's independence or if I'm a big Rolex collector. Like, I want creativity and innovation in the world of watches in which I collect is probably what they would have meant, right? Like, I don't care if there's creativity and innovation from Jacob and Company, because I don't collect in that lane and that's not my world or something I'm interested in. Now, the other thing we heard loud and clear was that there's a huge sensitivity to price. And we'll talk all about the survey results. And by the way, we shared those survey results and findings with the brands with which we've been meeting at Geneva Watch Days. And we're not only going to share the results of the survey with you, we're going to share what we heard back from the brands, which I think is interesting. So that will probably be our next episode. But I think Good tease. I think in that case, what we heard was people are really sensitive to price increases in particular, that prices of watches seem to be going up and up and up. And I can see someone feeling like, I love Studio Underdog, I want to keep collecting their stuff. And now, and I know this isn't a fair sort of comparison. Now a Studio Underdog just went from $1,000-ish to $59,000-ish. I feel like the watch I want and the thing I'm interested and passionate about just went extremely far out of reach. I'm not saying I agree with that, but I'm saying how I think we can reconcile what we heard in the survey and from the community with what we're seeing in the some of the response. Some of the response is also very encouraging and positive, but yes, there's definitely a very vocal and significant number of people who are really upset about it.
Yeah, and two thoughts on this before we move on. You said something over breakfast which I thought was really fascinating, where you were like, "Well, actually, this reminds me of AP's release of the code 1159 and Tudor's release of the P01 a few years ago." With the P01, everyone thought we were going to get a Tudor sub. Instead, they got a, extremely funky, weird archival piece, which I still think is one of Tudor's coolest watches, but definitely was not what people thought they were going to get. And the marketing kind of was leading them down the path to suggest one thing and then doing another. And then,
during the tease, of course, Tudor did nothing to, disabuse anybody of those notions, right?
Totally. And same thing with code 1159, where I think expecting something very different than what was launched. So there's something in here where I think it's sort of a lesson I take away from this, which is how, when marketing a watch or when launching a product, really thinking through, well, what are the expectations I'm setting? The other thing, however, and I remember a couple last year at Geneva Watch Days, I was on a panel and I got asked, do you ever get upset when someone says something negative about a collaboration you reach or that you released? And to me, I think I said something to the effect of, no, because it'd be a lot more depressing if nobody cared. The thing is, a lot of people really care about this, which tells me two things. One, that both Moser and Studio Underdog have deeply, deeply passionate collectors. And two, look, man, for better or for worse, this was the story of yesterday. And as Studio Underdog grows, sometimes like there are going to be bumps in the road, but and I think that's what this is, by the way. I think this is a bump in a very long road for Richard Bank and for Studio Underdog.
And to be clear, we both love this project.
Yeah,
exactly the way it is.
And it's a project, by the way, that I cannot personally afford to buy.
But I still love that it exists.
Yeah.
I was just so excited to see those watches. We went into the Moser meeting
This is what we wanted to see.
And this is what we wanted to see. And we saw it, and we didn't know what we were seeing because the watch actually hadn't been officially released by the time we were in the Moser meeting. We went in right at the beginning of the day before it was officially unveiled, and we were excited to see it. We saw it, and we were even more excited, I think, after seeing it and knowing that it was bundled. Our first response to knowing that it was a bundled project where you have to buy both watches was, that's so awesome, because I love what this says is these two things are part and parcel. And the idea that they express and the passion for watch design and watchmaking and watch collecting that they share, it comes together. There's no separating them by price point or anything like this. These are an expression of the same idea. And I thought that was particularly heartening. Now I can understand why people reacted to it in a negative way, but to be clear, we love the project, we love Moser, and we love Studio Underdog.
Yeah. So anyway, that's me to check out. And if you want to leave your thoughts about that, please do so on Instagram. Shoot us an email. We'd love to know, because this is a really interesting thing that has happened and has a lot of implications creatively and professionally and economically on the industry. And we're very interested to hear what you guys have to say.
So speaking of the stakes being higher at Watches and Wonders, there was another announcement yesterday. There are sort of two announcements, and the second was around an alternative horological alliance. And you pointed out to me there's the substance of what was announced, but you pointed out to me kind of the sort of the irony or the richness of this announcement happening at Geneva Watch Days.
Yeah.
Do you want to recap that?
Sure. So our friend, and full disclosure, we are a retailer of him as well, Josh Shapiro, told me a few months ago about this, and I've been extremely excited to see it come to life. He has formed a consortium, so it's not a conglomerate. These guys aren't in business together in sort of the traditional sense of it, but he's working with Ming and he's working with Fleming. So the three brands, Shapiro, Fleming, and Ming, who, by the way, are all here sharing a space at Geneva Watch Days, have created this alliance, which is about sharing resources and, in some cases, intellectual property for the advancement of independent watchmaking, and starting with those three brands. In this particular instance, the alliance was announced with the release of a full tantalum bracelet that is very similar aesthetically to the universal bracelet that Ming has been releasing in, I think it's titanium or steel. It's one of those for the last few years. But this time is in tantalum, which, as everybody knows, is a very difficult metal to work with. One that Josh Shapiro is quite familiar with because he has current watch in production that he manufactures the case for in tantalum. This bracelet is made of tantalum in Los Angeles at the J.N. Shapiro workshop and is capable of fitting not just every J.N. Shapiro tantalum watch, but also the Fleming tantalum watch and previous releases from Ming that are rendered in tantalum. And on the one hand, you can look at it and sort of just say, oh, yeah, well, that's cool. Like, that's awesome. But what it implies is something really amazing. Think about this. We have a Malaysian watch brand and two American watch brands, one of whom is a proper manufacturer making their own components, coming to Switzerland to declare their independence from the Swiss watch industry, which is just wild, but also incredibly interesting and exciting, because not only does it portend cool component and design work coming out from these three brands, but it also suggests, one, that independent brands can support one another, which they've been doing for years behind the scenes, intellectually, creatively, etc., but that they can do so publicly, and that they can do so and still compete with one another. I think that's awesome. And in a sense, like, that's kind of how the industry has worked. I mean, there are suppliers that supply, brands that are in direct competition with each other here in Switzerland. Nobody says two things about it. And then here we have, three brands, which may not necessarily be in the same consideration set for a collector, but, in some cases compete at similar price points or close to, and saying, you know what, we want to work together because there's things that we all want, and individually they're too expensive or too daunting to invest the time in because there's other places I want to place my resources. But if all of us share in the cost, in the IP development and the rest, well, that reduces the risk and it also increases accessibility. And that is really kind of wonderful. And if you start taking this to its logical conclusion, where you get to is the idea that movement components could be manufactured for all three brands, or however many brands end up joining the alliance should it continue to grow, in J.N. Shapiro's workshop, but then shipped around the world to be able to empower creativity for independent watch brands from everywhere. And vice versa, that helps Josh grow because increasing capacity, I suspect, also helps justify the cost of the monstrously expensive machinery that is required for the kind of watchmaking that Josh is doing, and probably lowers the cost for acquiring the output from that because it's not a for-profit endeavor. It's about sharing resources. So instead of going to a supplier who will say, well, you have to buy a minimum order quantity of, say, 500 bracelets from me, and I'm going to make a profit on those bracelets because I have to, because that's my business. Now we have somebody saying, all right, well, if we all share in the cost of this, then the per unit cost may go down. There's no such thing as a minimum order quantity per se. And we can slowly scale our own businesses and have more control over one of the most erratic components of watch manufacture, which is the pricing of components. And that's just really, really fascinating to me. And in my mind, might be some of the biggest news that's coming out of this Geneva Watch Days.
Yeah, it's interesting. When you pointed out to me sort of the irony of coming to Switzerland to announce your independence, or something you were doing to sort of have some independence from the traditional watchmaking industry, which is really rooted in Switzerland. I was like, wow, that's interesting. Do you think anyone in the Swiss watch industry noticed or cared?
Yeah, I do. And I don't think that, I mean, you can look at it as sort of like an
they get kicked out of the Beau Rivage. By the way,
they're actual exhibitors.
Yeah, all three of these brands are exhibiting at the Beau Rivage. But I do think it does take some chutzpah to come.
Excellent choice of word.
To come to Switzerland, to get a suite at the Beau Rivage, and to announce an alternative horological alliance. I think that's really cool. Do you think that ruffles any feathers? Or do you think the tent is big enough in the Swiss watch industry that the attitude is, hey, that's great, welcome?
I don't know that it's either, frankly. I mean, like, look at it more broadly. Of the three companies there, Shapiro, Fleming, and Ming is the one that produces the most watches by volume annually. And even though Ming makes a lot of watches relative to Fleming and Shapiro, the total amount of watches produced by the three of them is minuscule relative to the broader Swiss watch market. So I don't think the removal of, tantalum bracelet orders from the Swiss component market is going to make like severe, economic dents or anything. But what I think is awesome about it, and where I suspect a lot of folks kind of look at this is like, okay, like, let's see where that goes. And, I don't think Josh's and Ming's and Thomas's ambition here is to eclipse the Swiss supply chain. I think they are just trying to say, in order for us to be able to create amazing watches, we need a little bit more control, and small orders for components are outrageously expensive and probably, to be honest with you, aren't terribly attractive to a lot of gigantic component manufacturers. It's a pain in the butt to make very, very high quality product in limited runs, because whether you're making 100 of something or 10,000 of something, you still have to do all the setup to make it work. So I suspect like there are probably a lot of people that kind of just went, wow, that's pretty cool. Another thing which I find really fascinating, by the way, and someone made a comment to me earlier today that was interesting, which is, Ming is a watch designer, Thomas Fleming is a watch designer, and Josh Shapiro is literally a watchmaker. Someone's like, is it weird that this alliance was formed between two companies that are design driven largely and somebody who's production driven? And I was sort of smiling, and I was like, it's so interesting because that's kind of Kari Voutilainen's model, in the sense that,
well, that was the comment to you, is like, isn't Josh more of a Kari Voutilainen than the other brands which are more design driven?
Yeah, and my thought, as I sat there and sort of pondered that, was he's quite a Kari Voutilainen, because this is a Kari move, right? I mean, what did Kari do over the last few years? He slowly acquired component manufacturers, and then he makes those components probably more affordable, at scale, because think of how many watches, including ones that we've sold, our Arm & Strom leveraged components made by Comblemine, which is a Kari Voutilainen owned company, So I think it was ironically, this person's insight was completely on point. This is a Kari move.
They just didn't realize how on point their comment, how on point the comment is. But yeah, no, that was another great insight over. We should have just recorded the podcast over breakfast, because that's where all the good podcasts and it's 9 a.m. in the morning, right after breakfast. So we actually do put in some work to prepare for these things. But look, 3 interesting anecdotes from Geneva Watch Days. Only the first day of Geneva Watch Days, and all the drama.
Before we go, I want to break our tradition here, and because I think we saw a lot of really awesome things.
I was going to ask you, what's the coolest thing you saw yesterday?
Oh, I was going to ask you first.
Well, I'll tell you, the coolest thing I saw. Well, okay, I'm one of these watches it was not new. I'm just haunted by it. and the other, what that's going to be. And then the other, what was new. So I'll go real quick on both. The first one that I just continue to be haunted by was something that was released at Watches and Wonders, which is the Singer Dive Track.
Mm-hmm.
And this is, what's the pricing on this watch, Asher?
$98,000 USD.
$98,000 dive watch. But it is one of the most, I think we've talked about on a previous podcast, but it is one of the most creative, unusual, and I think consequential dive watches I've ever seen. Just a masterclass of design and technology. The entire mid case of the watch is made of sapphire. It's just a reconceiving, and a very creative reconceiving of the dive watch format done in Singer's voice. It's an incredible watch, and we saw a lot of great watches at Singer. We love the brand. To full disclosure, we carry and we retail Singer, but this is a watch that
the dive track is why we retail Singer.
The dive track is why. I mean, we picked up Singer right after Watches and Wonders on the back of that pushed us over the edge. It's just an incredible watch. It's one of those watches that stays with you, and the more time you spend with it, or for me, the more time I spend with it, the more I continue to just appreciate and be satisfied and awed by it.
Not only is it an amazing creative execution, it's incredibly ballsy to walk down a very well-trodden road of the dive watch. And as they did with the Track 1, their initial, their chronograph, just blow up the design tropes associated with either an automotive chronograph or, in this case, a dive watch, and do so in a way that creates not just a awesome piece on its own, but the potential for an entire line of watches that serve the same purpose, but break the mold relative to form factor, design, etc. It's really, if you've never looked at it, and I think we're going to do a hands-on video with this.
Yeah, we're going to do an article and a hands-on video. If you guys haven't checked out yet on YouTube, we've been doing a ton of hands-on reviews for independent watches because there just aren't a ton out there. And our blog as well, collectivehorology.com/blog, we've been doing a bunch of in-depth interviews reviews on a lot of those same watches, again, because there just isn't that kind of content around there around independent watches. So we will do one on the dive track. We came specifically to get some footage of it and to get some more info for that. So look out for that. In terms of novelties, the watch that this is an incredibly satisfying watch that the more time I spend with it, the more I'm impressed with it, is the Speak Marine Ripple skeleton. And again, full disclosure, we are Speak Marine authorized retailers. The Ripples is an interesting watch. It's their version of a stainless steel integrated bracelet sports watch. They launched that platform just 2 years ago, and now, a mere 2 years later, they came out with not just a skeletonized version of that watch, but a complete re-engineering of that watch from the ground up. So the skeletonized version, the skeleton features not just a skeletonized movement, but it's an entirely new caliber that they custom designed and built just for this watch. It's got a micro rotor movement. It's not just skeletonized. It's a 5 hertz micro rotor movement. The movement is just over 3 millimeters thick. And what that means is the watch itself is just over 6 millimeters in thickness. So it's an incredibly thin integrated bracelet stainless steel sports watch. beautiful movement architecture and finishing. And what I love about the movement architecture and the finishing is the bridges on the watch, and the architecture of the bridges is a nod back to the original Ripples design, which is called the Ripples because they have these horizontal waves or sort of ripples that run across the dial. And so the bridge work of this watch runs horizontally across the dial of the watch, meant as to be a sort of a nod. So it's one of those watches that's just a complete thought watch from the movement all the way out, and is something that there's just so much in this watch to appreciate, that the more time you spend with it, the more it sort of reveals itself. And I just, again, like that Singer dive track, I find it an incredibly satisfying watch. And so that's one that is just with me. And we got to try one on yesterday, and I was like ready to run out of the room with that thing on my wrist. It wears incredibly well.
Yeah. How far can you run with a watch at a watch show?
Well, we know the security at the Beau Rivage is very...
we're back on the Beau Rivage.
It's very tight. So I certainly wouldn't have gotten out of there with that on my wrist. What about you?
I'll leave you guys with something that blew my mind in a very different way. In a whole other part of the world, where watchmaking has been thriving and growing creatively, is one of, in my mind, the masters of modern independent watchmaking, Konstantin Chaikin, who yesterday, out of nowhere, announced his newest watch, not a joker, which, by the way, for those who are not familiar, is only the tip of the iceberg of what Chaikin can produce. He released his new watch called the Thin King, a portmanteau of thin and king, which is, out of nowhere, went and just grabbed the holy grail of the thinnest watch ever made from the likes of Piaget, from the likes of Richard Mille, from the likes of Bulgari, and released, I'm going to make sure I get these stats right because they are mind-blowing. Yeah, the Thin King is 1.65 millimeters in height. Unbelievable. And when you look at the way he did it, I'm going to read a couple of key points here. The case is 40 millimeters by 1.65 millimeters in height. It's 13 grams. 13 grams without the strap. It has to be manually wound with a key, so that's similar to like the Richard Mille and some of the other ultra thin watches that we've seen from Bulgari and Piaget in the past. The movement itself has 204 components. 204 components in this tiny little case. A very interesting innovation.
It's also not that many.
No.
Yeah.
The way they handle the hands are really fascinating. They're printed directly onto the gear spokes themselves. Which is a really, like, think about that for a second. That's a really fascinating way of telling time. So there's no hands on the watch. It's just one of the spokes of the gears has been painted essentially, or treated in some fashion to tell the time. So it's genius. He eliminates the need for a hand by just saying, I'm not going to even use a hand. I'm just going to reinvent. I'm going to look at what I've got and I'm just going to use that. To me, like, I look at stuff like that and I think this is part of why I love watchmaking. You know, like, who cares no one knows what this watch is going to cost, by the way. And it's starting to be like, who cares? Like, it's irrelevant, you know, because this is just proof positive that something can be done. And to me, that's part of what keeps this industry so vibrant and so interesting. You know, we talk about the business of it all the time, but the reason we're in this business in the first place is for stuff like this.
Well, from a business standpoint, I also think it's rather remarkable because the examples given of other ultra-thin watches, Bulgari, Piaget, Richard Mille, these are all brands that are very much inside the core of the watch industry.
And probably funded a lot better than Chaikin, I suspect.
They're not necessarily all, quote, Swiss brands, but they're brands whose watchmaking happens in Switzerland. They're part of the main industry. They are extremely well capitalized, even if, Richard Mille is an independent brand.
I don't think Richard Mille is hurting for capital.
No, but these are brands that are extremely well capitalized. And Chaikin is very much, he's an independent brand. He is an industry outsider in many ways. And so
and in
for
a country
him to
where
do
I
this,
suspect doing business with the rest of the world at this particular point in time is not easy,
to say the least. So to me, it's an even more remarkable feat. We did not see the watch, but we did see a 3D printed version of
which,
the
by
watch,
the way, was twice the thickness
Yeah.
of the watch in itself was
Remarkable.
obscene. Our friend Pietro Tomahar from the limited edition was wearing essentially an acrylic printed version of it, which blew my mind, and even further when he pointed out to me that they couldn't even get the acrylic thin enough to represent the watch effectively, which is just amazing. So side note, if you're interested in that, not only should you check that out there, but we would encourage you to go check out the limited edition. And I'm positive that he'll be releasing some content around that watch.
Yeah, just absolutely remarkable and staggering on every level. And like we said, even more impressive to do it as Konstantin Chaikin, and an independent brand who's not really living, existing, participating in the very core of the Swiss watch industry. A real hat tip and a nice coda to sort of the alliance that we talked about with Shapiro, Ming, and Thomas Fleming. It's rather amazing what the outsiders can achieve.
So with that, I think I'm going to throw Gabe out of my hotel room. We're recording this like I'm the bouncer at the Beau Rivage.
All right. No more business talk at the Hotel Envy either. All right. Well, this has been another episode of Open Work. It's a production of Collective Horology. You can find us at collectivehorology.com. That's where you can find all of the new releases that we've got from Geneva Watch Days, including some hands-on content for novelties from Speak Marin, if you want to see that Ripple skeleton, and Chapek. We've got a ton of hands-on content on the site, so check that out. And if you'd like to get in touch, just email us at podcast@collectivehorology.com.